On the morning of April 7, 1945, Captain Robert Moore sat in the cockpit of his P-51D Mustang on Iwo Jima's South Field, preparing for a mission Japanese fighter commanders had declared impossible. The target was Tokyo, 360 miles north across the open ocean. The aircraft he would escort were B-29 Superfortresses, flying at altitudes exceeding 30,000 feet where the air was so thin that conventional piston-engine fighters couldn't generate enough power to intercept. Japanese intelligence officers had calculated this scenario repeatedly since 1944. Their reports were unanimous. American single-engine fighters lacked the range to fly from any captured island to the Japanese home islands and return safely. Even if they somehow reached Japan, they couldn't climb high enough to protect the superfortresses. The B-29 seconds flew in a realm above fighter combat, protected not by escorts, but by altitude itself. Japanese interceptor pilots had been briefed accordingly. They would face only the bomber's defensive guns. No American fighters would appear over Tokyo. They were catastrophically wrong. Moore's Mustang carried two 108-gallon drop tanks under its wings, supplementing the internal fuel capacity that would give him enough range to fly to Tokyo, fight for 20 minutes at maximum combat power, and return to Iwo Jima with a reserve. But range was only half the equation. The P-51D could climb to 30,000 feet and maintain combat effectiveness in the thin air where B-29 seconds operated. For the first time in the Pacific War, American heavy bombers would have fighter escort over the Japanese homeland, and the Japanese had no idea it was coming. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Japanese confidence in the B-29's invulnerability began with sound engineering principles. Boeing had designed the Superfortress specifically to operate beyond the reach of enemy fighters. The aircraft's four Wright R-3350 engines, each generating 2,200 horsepower, could push the bomber to altitudes exceeding 35,000 feet when flying with reduced bomb loads. At those heights, the air pressure was less than one-third that at sea level. Conventional fighters struggled to generate sufficient lift and engine power. Japan's best interceptor in early 1945 was the Kawasaki Ki-61 Tony, a liquid-cooled fighter that performed well at medium altitudes but lost effectiveness above 25,000 feet. The aircraft's Ha-40 engine, producing 1,175 horsepower at sea level, could barely generate 700 horsepower at 30,000 feet. Pilots reported that climbing above 28,000 feet required 10 to 15 minutes of steady climbing, during which the fighter consumed fuel rapidly and became vulnerable to attack. The Nakajima Ki-84 Frank, introduced in 1944, offered better high-altitude performance. Its Ha-45 engine maintained power more effectively in thin air, and the aircraft could reach 33,000 feet given enough time. But operational ceilings listed in specifications didn't reflect combat reality. Reaching 33,000 feet required a clean configuration, no external stores, minimal ammunition, and optimal weather conditions. In combat, loaded with fuel and ammunition, the Ki-84 struggled to intercept B-29 seconds, flying at their operational altitude. Japanese pilots attacking B-29 formations in late 1944 and early 1945 faced a consistent problem. By the time their fighters climbed to the bomber's altitude, the superfortresses had already dropped their ordnance and turned for home. The pursuit required full throttle, burning fuel at unsustainable rates. Most interception attempts ended, with Japanese fighters running low on fuel before they could position for effective attacks. The B-29 seconds simply flew too high, too fast, and too far for conventional interception tactics to work consistently. This technical reality shaped Japanese defensive strategy throughout the early months of the B-29 campaign. If fighters couldn't reach the bombers effectively, then anti-aircraft artillery would have to compensate. The Japanese Army and Navy concentrated their best flak units around Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and other critical industrial centers. Heavy anti-aircraft guns, mostly 88mm and 105mm weapons, were positioned in interlocking fields of fire designed to create boxes of exploding steel at specific altitudes. But anti-aircraft fire faced the same altitude problem that plagued Japanese fighters. Effective flak required accurate range-finding and precise fuse settings. At 30,000 feet, even a slight miscalculation in altitude, aircraft speed meant shells exploded hundreds of feet from their targets. American B-29 crews reported that the Japanese flak was heavy and visually intimidating, but rarely accurate at extreme altitudes. The black bursts of exploding shells filled the sky, yet most superfortresses returned to their bases with minimal or no battle damage from anti-aircraft fire. Japanese commanders understood they faced an unprecedented challenge. American strategic bombing doctrine had evolved to exploit technological advantages in ways that negated traditional defensive measures. The B-29 operated in a tactical environment where altitude substituted for fighter escort, where pressurized cabins kept crews comfortable while defenders struggled with oxygen deprivation, where sophisticated radar bombing systems allowed accurate strikes even through cloud cover that hid targets from visual observation. Throughout late 1944, Japanese defensive planning assumed this situation would continue. The Americans controlled several island bases within the B-29 range of Japan, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam in the Marianas. These bases sat approximately 1,500 miles south of Tokyo, precisely the distance the superfortress was designed to operate across. But none of those islands could support single-engine fighters flying combat missions to Japan. The distance was simply too great. Intelligence reports confirmed that American P-38 Lightnings and P-47 Thunderbolts, the primary long-range fighters in the Pacific Theater, had maximum combat radii of approximately 450 to 500 miles with external fuel tanks. That was adequate for escorting medium bombers on tactical missions within the Southwest Pacific, but completely insufficient for strategic operations against the Japanese homeland. Even the newer P-51 Mustang, rumored to have exceptional range, couldn't bridge the 1,500-mile gap from the Marianas to Tokyo. This calculation gave Japanese planners a sense of security. The B-29 seconds might bomb Japan with relative impunity, but they would do so without fighter protection. That meant Japanese interceptors could focus entirely on attacking the bombers, developing specialized tactics without worrying about enemy fighters disrupting their approaches. It meant anti-aircraft batteries could concentrate their fire at bomber altitudes without having to track escort fighters at different heights. The strategic bombing campaign would be costly for both sides, but Japan would have time to adapt its defenses and develop new interceptor aircraft specifically designed for high-altitude combat. What Japanese intelligence failed to anticipate was that American military planners weren't satisfied with the status quo. Unescorted bomber operations over Japan had proven effective against urban industrial targets, particularly after Major General Curtis LeMay shifted tactics to low-altitude incendiary attacks in March 1945. But the Army Air Forces wanted more. They wanted the capability to escort B-29 seconds on daylight precision strikes against specific industrial facilities, particularly aircraft factories and oil refineries, where pinpoint accuracy mattered more than area destruction. That capability required fighter bases closer to Japan than the Marianas. It required an island positioned along the direct flight path between the Mariana bases and Tokyo, an island where fighters could land, refuel, and either escort bombers the rest of the way or provide emergency landing facilities for damaged aircraft. American strategists had identified such an island. It was called Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima sat in the Volcano Islands chain, approximately 660 miles north of the Marianas and 360 miles south of Tokyo. The island was a barren volcanic rock, barely 8 square miles in total area, dominated by Mount Suribachi, a 550-foot extinct volcano at the southern tip. Japanese forces had occupied Iwo Jima since 1941, maintaining a small garrison and constructing airfields for reconnaissance aircraft and fighters protecting the sea lanes between Japan and the Marshall Islands. By late 1944, Iwo Jima's garrison had grown to approximately 21,000 troops under Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, one of Japan's most capable defensive tacticians. Kuribayashi understood the island's strategic significance perfectly. American possession of Iwo Jima would provide fighter bases within range of Tokyo, emergency landing facilities for damaged B-29 seconds, and advance warning stations for Japanese air raids against the Marianas. He also understood that defending Iwo Jima with conventional tactics would fail. The Japanese military had spent 3 years learning painful lessons about island defense against American amphibious assaults. Defending at the water's edge led to annihilation by naval gunfire, banzai charges, wasted troops, without inflicting proportional casualties on attackers. What worked was defense in depth, using the terrain to create interlocking fields of fire, forcing attackers to fight for every yard of ground while defending forces remained protected in fortified positions that could survive sustained bombardment. Kuribayashi implemented these lessons with obsessive thoroughness. His engineers carved 16 miles of tunnels into Iwo Jima's volcanic rock, creating an underground fortress connected by passages that allowed troops to move between positions without exposing themselves to fire. Artillery and mortar positions were dug into caves with multiple entrances and exits. Blockhouses were constructed with walls 6 feet thick, reinforced with concrete and steel, capable of surviving direct hits from naval guns. Machine gun nests were positioned to provide overlapping fire across every potential landing beach. The island's defences included approximately 360 artillery pieces ranging from 70mm mountain guns to massive 320mm mortars, along with 6,500 machine guns and heavy weapons positions scattered throughout the tunnel networks. Kuribayashi stockpiled ammunition, food, and water sufficient for prolonged resistance. He ordered his troops to fight from fortified positions, inflict maximum casualties on attackers, and make the Americans pay in blood for every foot of volcanic ash they captured. American military planners knew Iwo Jima would be costly. Intelligence estimates predicted the island would fall within 5 to 7 days once the Marines landed. Those estimates proved catastrophically optimistic. The Battle of Iwo Jima began on February 19, 1945, when 30,000 Marines from the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Divisions hit beaches on the island's southeast coast. Within minutes, they realized they were walking into the most heavily fortified island the United States had ever assaulted. Japanese defensive fire opened up from positions the preliminary naval bombardment had barely touched. Artillery shells and mortar rounds fell with coordinated precision on beaches where Marines struggled through volcanic sand that swallowed men to their ankles. The black sand provided no cover, no concealment, just an open killing ground where Japanese gunners had pre-registered every square yard. Amphibious tractors burned on the beach. Landing craft backed away, unable to offload their troops under the intense fire. By nightfall on the first day, the Marines had secured a beachhead approximately 4,000 yards wide and 700 yards deep, but at terrible cost. Casualties exceeded 2,500 men, including nearly 600 dead. Mount Suribachi loomed over the southern end of the beachhead, its slopes honeycombed with fortifications that poured fire onto American positions below. Taking that volcano would require days of fighting. The battle devolved into a nightmare of cave warfare. Marines attacking Japanese positions faced enemies who disappeared into tunnels after firing, reappearing minutes later hundreds of yards away to attack from a different angle. Flamethrower teams and demolition squads worked yard by yard, sealing caves with explosives, burning out defenders with napalm, only to discover the same positions reoccupied hours later through underground passages they hadn't found. Artillery and naval gunfire proved largely ineffective against targets hidden underground. Airstrikes could crater the surface, but couldn't collapse the tunnel systems. Mount Suribachi fell on February 23rd, after 4 days of fighting that cost 795 Marine casualties. The iconic photograph of 6 Marines raising the American flag on the summit became the defining image of the Pacific War. But taking Suribachi was only the beginning. The island's northern sectors contained even stronger fortifications. 2 Japanese airfields, Motoyama numbers 1 and 2 sat in the center of the island, surrounded by defensive positions that had to be taken through direct assault. Marines fighting for the airfields encountered Japanese defenders who held their fire until attackers were within yards, then opened up with machine guns and rifles from concealed positions. Tank infantry teams made slow progress, measuring advances in yards per hour rather than miles per day. The volcanic terrain provided no natural cover. Every position had to be taken by frontal assault against fortifications designed to withstand exactly that kind of attack. The casualties mounted with horrific regularity. By the end of the first week, Marine divisions that had landed at full strength were operating at 60 to 70% of authorized personnel. Rifle companies that should have fielded 200 men were down to 120 or fewer. Battalion commanders found themselves leading units that had lost all their company commanders and most of their platoon leaders. Lieutenants with a week's combat experience commanded companies. Sergeants led platoons. Japanese casualties were even worse, but Kuribayashi's defensive strategy ensured that every Japanese soldier killed took a proportional number of Americans with him. The pre-planned defensive positions, the interlocking fields of fire, the underground tunnel networks that allowed tactical withdrawals and counterattacks, all combined to create a defensive system that maximized American casualties while preserving Japanese combat power as long as possible. By March 1st, 10 days into the battle, Marines controlled most of the southern two-thirds of Iwo Jima, including both airfields. But the northern portion of the island remained in Japanese hands, defended by approximately 10,000 troops, still capable of sustained resistance. American casualties had reached 11,000, including 2,400 dead. The battle showed no signs of ending quickly. Yet, even as Marines fought for control of Iwo Jima's northern sectors, American engineers were already converting the captured airfields into operational bases. The Seabees, Navy construction battalions, arrived on February 20th, barely 24 hours after the initial landing. They came ashore, carrying the same volcanic sand that slowed Marine advances, immediately beginning repairs to Motoyama Airfield No. 1, which Japanese defenders had systematically destroyed before retreating. Bomb craters pockmarked the runway. Artillery had torn up sections of the coral surface. Defensive positions dug across the flight line had to be filled and graded. Construction crews worked under Japanese artillery fire that fell sporadically on the airfield from positions in the island's north. Seabees operated bulldozers and graders, while Marines provided security against infiltrators who tried to sabotage equipment during the night. Despite the conditions, the Seabees completed emergency repairs to Motoyama, No. 1 by March 4th, creating a usable runway 6,500 feet long, adequate for fighter operations, but not long enough for B-29 seconds. The first aircraft to use Iwo Jima's captured airfield was a B-29 that hadn't planned to be there. On March 4th, the Superfortress Dynamite, returning from a bombing mission over Tokyo with battle damage and fuel starvation, diverted to Iwo Jima rather than attempting the 660-mile flight back to the Marianas. The bomber landed successfully on Motoyama No. 1's partially completed runway, demonstrating exactly why American military planners had considered Iwo Jima essential. Over the following weeks, as Marines continued fighting for control of the island's northern sectors, damaged B-29 seconds used Iwo Jima with increasing frequency. Emergency landings averaged 1 to 2 per day through March, rising to 3 to 4 per day by April, as construction crews lengthened and improved the runways. By the time Iwo Jima was declared secure on March 26th, after 36 days of fighting that cost the Marines nearly 7,000 dead and 19,000 wounded, Seabees had already begun construction on facilities to support fighter operations. The human cost of securing Iwo Jima remained staggering even by Pacific War standards. Of the 70,000 Marines who participated in the battle, nearly one-third became casualties. 27 Medals of Honor were awarded for actions on Iwo Jima, 14 of them posthumously. Japanese losses were even more complete. Of the 21,000-man garrison, approximately 20,000 were killed. Only about 1,000 were captured, most of them too badly wounded to continue fighting. but the strategic dividend justified the cost in the cold calculation of military planning. Iwo Jima provided exactly what American commanders needed, a forward base positioned along the direct flight path between the Marianas and Tokyo, capable of supporting fighter operations that could escort B-29 seconds over Japan and provide emergency landing facilities for bombers that couldn't complete the return flight to their home bases. The 7th Fighter Group arrived at Iwo Jima's South Field on March 6, 1945, less than 2 weeks after Marines had secured the airfield. The group flew P-51D Mustangs, the most advanced long-range fighter in the American arsenal. Each aircraft carried 2 108-gallon drop tanks that extended its combat radius to approximately 800 miles, more than adequate to reach Tokyo from Iwo Jima and return with fuel to spare. The Mustang's arrival on Iwo Jima represented the convergence of 3 critical factors that Japanese planners had failed to anticipate. First, the capture of an island positioned at exactly the right distance from both the Marianas bomber bases and the Japanese homeland. Second, the development of a single-engine fighter with sufficient range to operate from that island to Tokyo. Third, the engineering capability to transform a battle-scarred volcanic rock into an operational fighter base in less than 3 weeks. Japanese intelligence had tracked American fighter development throughout the war. They knew about the P-51 Mustang and understood its exceptional range capabilities. Reports from Luftwaffe pilots who had faced Mustangs over Germany in 1944 described an aircraft that could escort bombers deep into enemy territory and still maintain combat effectiveness. But Japanese analysts had consistently concluded that Pacific distances exceeded even the Mustang's capabilities. The calculation seemed straightforward. The Marianas sat 1,500 miles from Tokyo. Even with drop tanks, a P-51 couldn't fly that distance, fight, and return safely. The mathematics were unambiguous. Therefore, B-29 seconds operating from the Marianas would continue flying, unescorted. Japanese defensive planning could focus entirely on bomber interception without worrying about fighter opposition. That analysis was technically correct. P-51 seconds couldn't escort bombers from the Marianas to Tokyo, but it failed to account for the possibility that Americans would capture and develop an intermediate base that would make the entire calculation irrelevant. Iwo Jima changed everything. From that island, Tokyo sat only 360 miles away. A P-51D with full internal fuel and 2 drop tanks could fly to Tokyo, engage in 20 to 30 minutes of air combat at full military power, and return to Iwo Jima with sufficient reserve fuel to handle weather diversions or minor battle damage. The first P-51 escort mission from Iwo Jima launched on April 7, 1945. The 7th Fighter Group put up 108 Mustangs to escort B-29 seconds from the 313th Bombardment Wing, attacking the Nakajima aircraft plant at Ota, northwest of Tokyo. The mission profile was straightforward. Fighters would rendezvous with the bombers over Iwo Jima, accompany them to the target area, provide top cover during the bomb run, and escort them back to the rendezvous point before returning to base. Captain Robert Moore led one of the 7th Group's squadrons that morning. He had flown P-40 seconds and P-47 seconds in the Southwest Pacific earlier in the war, accumulating 2 years of combat experience before transitioning to Mustangs. He understood fighter tactics, understood bomber escort procedures, and understood that this mission represented something unprecedented in the Pacific theater. For the first time, American heavy bombers would have continuous fighter protection over Japan. The flight north from Iwo Jima took approximately 90 minutes. The Mustangs flew at 18,000 feet, below the B-29 seconds cruising altitude, but positioned to climb rapidly if Japanese interceptors appeared. The Pacific stretched below, empty and grey under, scattered clouds. Navigation required careful attention. A 10-degree error in heading would put the fighters miles off course with no landmarks to correct by. Moore monitored his fuel consumption constantly, calculating burn rate against distance covered, ensuring his squadron maintained formation without excessive maneuvering that would waste fuel. They crossed the Japanese coast south of Tokyo at 1100 hours. Below, the landscape shifted from ocean to farmland, rice paddies and small villages connected by roads and rail lines. The weather had deteriorated since takeoff. Cloud layers obscured portions of the terrain. Visibility was maybe 5 miles, adequate for maintaining formation but problematic for spotting enemy fighters at distance. The B-29 seconds appeared ahead, silver crosses in the sky, flying in loose combat box formations at 28,000 feet. Moore counted approximately 60 bombers, spread across several miles of airspace. His squadron climbed to position, themselves 5,000 feet above the bomber stream, weaving gently to maintain position without overshooting. From 33,000 feet, he could see the approach to Tokyo, the industrial districts spreading across the plain, the rivers cutting through the city. Japanese fighters appeared at 11:20 hours. Moore spotted them first, contrails at his altitude, maybe 20 aircraft in formation, climbing from the northwest. He called it out on the radio. Bandits 11 o'clock high, estimate 20 plus, Angels 35. The other squadron leaders acknowledged. They had visual contact. The Japanese fighters were Kawasaki Ki 61 Tonys, liquid-cooled interceptors with inline engines similar in configuration to the Mustang, but with less power and inferior high-altitude performance. The Japanese formation split, half diving toward the bombers, half turning to engage the escorts. Moore called for his squadron to break right and engage. 12 Mustangs turned into the attacking fighters. What followed was 3 minutes of violent maneuvering at altitudes, where the air was so thin that aircraft responded sluggishly to control inputs. Moore fired a burst at a Tony that crossed in front of him, saw his tracers pass behind as the Japanese pilot broke hard left. He followed, pulling lead, firing again. Hits sparkled along Tony's fuselage. The Japanese fighter rolled inverted and dove away, trailing smoke. Moore didn't follow. Bomber escort doctrine was clear. Stay with the bombers. Don't pursue individual targets. If a fighter broke off, let him go. The mission was protecting the B-29 seconds, not accumulating personal victories. He climbed back to altitude, scanning for additional threats. The sky around him was empty of enemy aircraft. The engagement lasted less than 5 minutes. The Japanese had broken off, diving away to regroup or running low on fuel. Below, the B-29 seconds continued toward their target, undisturbed. That was the point. The fighters hadn't shot down every Japanese interceptor, hadn't even engaged most of them. But they had forced the Japanese to break off their attacks on the bombers. They had changed the tactical equation from unescorted bombers defending themselves to escorted bombers with fighters positioned to intercept attackers before they could press home effective attacks. The bombers reached Ota at 11:45 hours and began their bomb runs. Moore's squadron maintained position above, watching for additional Japanese fighters. Anti-aircraft fire erupted around the bombers, black bursts at 28,000 feet, but the flak was scattered and inaccurate. The B-29 seconds dropped their ordnance, 1,000-pound high-explosive bombs falling toward the Nakajima plant's assembly buildings. Explosions bloomed across the target area. The bomber stream turned south, heading back toward the coast. The return flight was uneventful. Japanese fighters appeared sporadically but didn't press attacks against the escorted formation. By 13:30 hours, the Mustangs were back over Iwo Jima, entering the landing pattern. Moore's fuel gauge showed 300 pounds remaining, roughly 45 gallons, adequate for landing with a small reserve. Other pilots reported similar fuel states. The mission had worked exactly as planned. Post-mission debriefs revealed the tactical impact. The 7th Fighter Group claimed 5 Japanese fighters destroyed, 3 probables, and 4 damaged for the loss of 2 Mustangs, 1 shot down by a Japanese fighter, 1 lost to engine failure over the ocean. But the significant statistic was bomber losses. Of the 63 B-29 seconds that had attacked Ota, all 63 returned safely to their bases in the Marianas. 0 bombers lost to enemy action. That result was unprecedented. Previous B-29 missions against Japanese urban and industrial targets had accepted loss rates of 2 to 5% as normal, occasionally spiking to 7 or 8% when Japanese defenses concentrated effectively. A mission with 0 bomber losses suggested that fighter escort had fundamentally changed the strategic bombing campaign's mathematics. Japanese commanders recognized the implications immediately. Reports from interceptor pilots described American fighters over Tokyo, single-engine Mustangs escorting the bombers, engaging Japanese fighters at high altitude with superior performance. Intelligence officers who had spent months calculating that such escorts were impossible now faced the reality that their calculations had been based on incomplete information. The Americans had captured Iwo Jima precisely to make those escorts possible. The psychological impact matched the tactical consequences. Japanese fighter pilots had grown accustomed to attacking unescorted B-29 formations, developing specialized tactics for approaching the bombers, positioning for deflection shots that would avoid the Superfortress's defensive guns. Those tactics assumed time to set up attacks, time to position properly, time to correct and make multiple passes if the first attack failed. Fighter escorts eliminated that time. Interceptors now had to fight through escort screens before reaching the bombers, expending fuel and ammunition in fighter-to-fighter combat rather than conserving resources for bomber attacks. The strategic bombing campaign's tempo increased immediately. With fighter escort available, B-29 missions could be flown in daylight against precision targets, rather than relying exclusively on nighttime incendiary attacks. Aircraft factories, oil refineries, shipping facilities, railroad marshalling yards all became vulnerable to daylight precision strikes where bombardiers could use visual aiming rather than radar. The accuracy improved dramatically. A factory that required 3 separate incendiary raids to destroy could be eliminated in a single daylight precision strike with fighter escort. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By mid-April 1945, 3 fighter groups operated from Iwo Jima, the 7th, the 15th, and the 21st. Together, they could put up more than 200 P-51 Mustangs for major escort missions. The logistics supporting these operations were staggering. Each fighter consumed approximately 400 gallons of fuel per mission. 200 fighters required 80,000 gallons. That fuel had to be shipped to Iwo Jima from the Marianas or directly from Pearl Harbor, offloaded onto an island with limited port facilities, and stored in tanks that had to be protected from Japanese artillery, still falling sporadically from holdout positions in the island's northern caves. Maintenance requirements were equally demanding. The Mustang's Packard-built Merlin engine was reliable, but required constant attention in the corrosive salt air environment of Iwo Jima. Sand and volcanic dust infiltrated everything, requiring more frequent oil changes and air filter replacements than normal. Ground crews worked in conditions that ranged from scorching daytime heat to cold nighttime temperatures, often under rain that turned the volcanic ash into mud that fouled equipment. Ammunition resupply presented another challenge. Each P-51D carried 6 50-caliber machine guns, with a total ammunition load of 1,880 rounds. A typical air combat engagement might expend 300 to 500 rounds. That meant fighters returning from missions required rearming, a process that involved loading belted ammunition into wing bays while simultaneously refueling and performing post-flight maintenance checks. Ground crews developed systems that allowed complete turnaround in under 2 hours, fast enough to launch a second mission the same day if required. The Japanese responded to the new tactical situation with modifications to their defensive doctrine. If American fighters could escort bombers over Tokyo, then Japanese interceptors needed to attack from positions and altitudes where the escorts couldn't effectively intervene. That meant developing tactics for high-speed diving attacks from extreme altitude, hitting the bomber formations and climbing away before escorts could engage, or low-altitude attacks from below, where the B-29 seconds belly-gun turrets had limited traverse and escorts had difficulty maintaining visual contact. Neither approach worked well in practice. High-altitude diving attacks required aircraft that could operate effectively above 35,000 feet, altitudes where even the best Japanese fighters struggled to maintain performance. The Kawasaki Ki-61 and Nakajima Ki-84, Japan's best high-altitude interceptors, lost engine power and maneuverability above 30,000 feet. Attempting to climb to 38 or 40,000 feet to position for diving attacks burned excessive fuel and left fighters vulnerable to American escorts patrolling at intermediate altitudes. Low-altitude attacks faced different problems. Approaching from below required fighters to climb through the bomber stream, exposing them to defensive fire from B-29 gunners and making them vulnerable to escorts diving from above. The complex three-dimensional geometry of intercepting bombers while avoiding fighters proved extremely difficult to execute. Most low-altitude attempts resulted in Japanese fighters being bounced by Mustangs before they could position for effective attacks on the bombers. The solution Japanese commanders settled on was numerical superiority. If individual interception attempts were being disrupted by American escorts, then the answer was to concentrate overwhelming numbers of fighters that could saturate the escort screen through sheer volume. Intelligence estimates suggested the Americans typically provided one escort fighter for every 2 to 3 bombers. A formation of 60 B-29 seconds might have 25 to 30 Mustangs protecting them. If Japan could put up 150 to 200 fighters, simple mathematics suggested enough would break through to inflict significant bomber losses. The problem was that Japan no longer had 150 to 200 fighters available for any single mission. The strategic bombing campaign had systematically destroyed Japan's aircraft production capacity. Factories that had produced 250 aircraft per month in late 1944 were producing 50 per month by April 1945, and that number continued declining. The aircraft that were produced often lacked critical components. Engines were in short supply. Trained pilots were even scarcer. Japan's pilot training program had collapsed under the cumulative losses of 3.5 years of war. The experienced pilots who had fought in China and the early Pacific campaigns were mostly dead. Their replacements received minimal training, sometimes as little as 100 hours total flight time before being assigned to combat units. Against American pilots with hundreds of hours of training and often extensive combat experience, these barely trained Japanese aviators had little chance. The tactical situation over Japan in April and May 1945 resembled a mathematical equation with one side steadily approaching zero. American forces could sustain their operations indefinitely. Fighter losses were replaced from production lines in the United States, turning out over 4,000 aircraft per month. Pilot losses were replaced from training programs, graduating thousands of pilots every month. Fuel, ammunition, spare parts, all flowed across the Pacific in an endless supply chain that Japanese submarines could no longer seriously threaten. Japanese forces had no such reserves. Every fighter lost was irreplaceable. Every pilot killed represented capabilities that couldn't be restored. Fuel stocks were critically low, with aviation gasoline reserves measured in days rather than months. The decision to launch major fighter interceptions required balancing the immediate tactical goal of stopping a specific bombing raid against the long-term strategic reality that the fighters and fuel expended couldn't be replaced for future operations. By May 1945, Japanese interceptor responses to B-29 raids had become sporadic and ineffective. American bomber crews reported missions where no Japanese fighters appeared at all, where anti-aircraft fire was the only opposition encountered. Fighter escort missions that had launched expecting major air battles found empty skies. The Mustang pilots flew to Tokyo, circled over the target area while bombers dropped their ordnance and returned to Iwo Jima without firing their guns. The psychological impact on Japanese military leadership was profound. The defensive strategy constructed around the premise that B-29 seconds would fly unescorted had proven completely wrong. American engineers had built fighter bases where Japanese planners insisted none could exist. American fighters had achieved performance and range Japanese intelligence said was impossible. American logistics had sustained operations that Japanese commanders calculated couldn't be maintained. Every premise that had guided Japanese defensive planning since late 1944 was being systematically disproven by operational reality. The B-29 seconds were not untouchable. They were escorted. The escorts were not limited by range. They operated from Iwo Jima. The Americans were not constrained by logistics. They built infrastructure faster than Japan could destroy it. Lieutenant Yoshio Shiga, a Japanese fighter pilot who had survived combat from 1942 through 1945, later described the shift in psychological terms. Early in the war, Japanese pilots believed they were technically and tactically superior to their opponents. That confidence eroded gradually through encounters with increasingly capable American aircraft and pilots. By 1945, Shiga said, Japanese pilots knew they were outmatched in every measurable category: aircraft performance, pilot training, numerical strength, logistical support. The appearance of P-51 seconds over Tokyo represented the final collapse of any remaining hope that Japan could defend its airspace. If American fighters could fly escort missions over the capital itself, then nowhere in Japan was safe. Factories couldn't be protected. Cities couldn't be defended. The strategic bombing campaign would continue until every industrial facility had been destroyed or Japan surrendered. There was no third option. The escort missions continued through May and June with devastating consistency. B-29 seconds struck the Mitsubishi aircraft plant at Nagoya on May 14th, with full fighter escort. 74 P-51 seconds from the 7th and 15th Fighter. Groups engaged approximately 50 Japanese interceptors, shooting down 16 confirmed with 4 probables, while losing 3 Mustangs. All bombers returned safely. The Nakajima plant at Musashino, northwest of Tokyo, was hit on May 24th with escort from 90 P-51 seconds. Japanese opposition was minimal. 5 enemy fighters were claimed destroyed. 0 bombers were lost. The statistics accumulated with brutal clarity. In April, B-29 missions with fighter escort lost an average of 8% of attacking aircraft to enemy action, compared to 3.2% for unescorted missions. In May, escorted missions lost 6%. By June, the number had dropped to 3%. The fighter escort wasn't just protecting bombers. It was systematically eliminating the Japanese fighter force through attrition, forcing the Japanese to either commit their remaining aircraft and lose them in unequal combat, or conserve them and allow the bombers to strike unopposed. Japanese commanders chose conservation. By July, interceptor responses to daylight raids had essentially ceased. The remaining fighters were being held in reserve for the expected American invasion of the home islands, a battle where aviation, fuel, and aircraft could be expended without regard for future operations, because there wouldn't be any future operations. Japan would fight the final battle with whatever resources remained, then the war would end, one way or another. The strategic bombing campaign had achieved air superiority not through massive fighter battles, but through the systematic destruction of Japan's ability to produce, fuel, and pilot aircraft. The appearance of P-51 seconds over Tokyo simply accelerated a process that was already inevitable. But the psychological impact of seeing American fighters over the capital, seeing escort formations that Japanese intelligence had sworn couldn't exist, broke something fundamental in Japanese defensive planning. The premise that distance equals safety, that geographic barriers provide protection, that enemy capabilities can be calculated and predicted based on existing technology. All those assumptions failed simultaneously when P-51 seconds appeared over Tokyo in April 1945. Japanese planners had built their entire defensive strategy around mathematical certainties that proved to be based on incomplete information. They had assumed Americans couldn't capture an island close enough to Japan to base fighters. They had assumed American fighters couldn't achieve the necessary range, even from a closer island. They had assumed American logistics couldn't support sustained operations from a recently captured base with minimal infrastructure. Every assumption was wrong. Americans did capture Iwo Jima. P-51 seconds did have sufficient range. American logistics did support sustained operations. The strategic situation Japanese commanders thought was impossible became operational reality. And once that reality established itself, the defensive calculations that had guided Japanese planning collapsed entirely. The final months of the Pacific War demonstrated the complete reversal of Japan's strategic position. From Pearl Harbor through mid-1944, Japanese forces had operated under the protective umbrella of distance. The vast Pacific Ocean had served as a defensive barrier that American forces needed years to cross. Each island chain captured brought American power incrementally closer, but the distances remained daunting, the logistical challenges enormous. By summer 1945, distance had become irrelevant. American forces controlled island bases across the Pacific from which they could strike any target in Japan with overwhelming force. B-29 Superfortresses operated with near-total impunity. Fighter escorts eliminated what little interceptor capability Japan retained. The defensive perimeter that had once stretched from Burma to the Marshall Islands had contracted to the home islands themselves, and even those weren't defensible. The missions from Iwo Jima in July and early August 1945 took on an almost routine character. P-51 seconds launched, rendezvoused with B-29 seconds, escorted them to targets across Japan, and returned to base. Japanese opposition was sporadic at best. Some missions encountered no enemy fighters at all. Anti-aircraft fire remained present but increasingly ineffective as trained gun crews were killed or reassigned and ammunition stocks depleted. On July 30th, 133 P-51 seconds escorted B-29 seconds, attacking the Mitsubishi oil refinery at Kawasaki. The Japanese put up approximately 20 fighters, mostly obsolete types that had been pulled from training units because operational interceptor squadrons no longer had enough aircraft to mount coordinated defenses. The engagement lasted 4 minutes. American pilots claimed 7 confirmed victories. All bombers returned safely. On August 2nd, the target was the Toyota automatic loom works at Nagoya, a factory that had been converted to aircraft component production. 96 P-51 seconds provided escort. No Japanese fighters appeared. The bombers struck their target without interference, destroying over 60% of the factory's productive capacity in a single raid. The mission report noted that the primary challenge had been weather navigation, not enemy action. These routine successes masked the extraordinary transformation that had occurred in less than 6 months. In February 1945, Japanese commanders had confidently assured their superiors that B-29 seconds would continue operating without fighter escort because geography and physics made such escorts impossible. By August, those same commanders were reporting that fighter escort had become so routine that Japanese interceptors could no longer effectively challenge American bombing operations. The shift hadn't resulted from a single decisive battle or technological breakthrough. It had emerged from the convergence of American strategic planning, engineering capability, and industrial production, with Japanese miscalculation about what was operationally feasible. Japanese planners had looked at the distances involved and concluded that fighter escorts couldn't work. American planners had looked at the same distances and concluded that they needed to capture Iwo Jima. The difference in approach reflected deeper differences in strategic culture. Japanese planning tended to emphasize what the enemy couldn't do based on current capabilities. American planning tended to emphasize what needed to be done and then developing capabilities to accomplish it. When faced with the problem of unescorted bombers taking unsustainable losses, Japanese planners concluded that Americans would have to accept those losses or stop bombing. American planners concluded that they needed to change the operational environment to make escorts possible. Iwo Jima represented that change. The island, itself, had negligible intrinsic value. 8 square miles of volcanic rock with no natural resources, no port facilities, no indigenous population of significance. Its value was purely positional, a consequence of geography that placed it at exactly the right distance from both the Mariana bomber bases and the Japanese home islands. American commanders recognized that value and were willing to pay the extraordinary cost required to capture it. Japanese commanders failed to recognize that value until it was too late to prevent its capture. The battle for Iwo Jima had cost the United States Marine Corps 6,821 dead and 19,217 wounded, a 26,000 casualty total that represented the highest casualty rate per day of combat of any battle in American military history. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet, later wrote that on Iwo Jima, "Uncommon valor was a common virtue," acknowledging the extraordinary sacrifices required to secure the island. Those sacrifices purchased exactly what American planners had intended: an unsinkable aircraft carrier positioned to dominate the air approaches to Japan. By August 1945, Iwo Jima hosted 3 fighter groups with approximately 250 P-51 Mustangs, multiple bomber squadrons for tactical support, reconnaissance units, air-sea rescue detachments, and the infrastructure to support sustained operations. The island had been transformed from a barren battlefield into one of the busiest military airfields in the world. The statistics on emergency landings alone justified the island's capture. Between March and August 1945, 2,408 B-29 Superfortresses made emergency landings on Iwo Jima's runways. Most were bombers that had sustained battle damage or mechanical failures that prevented them from completing the full return flight to the Marianas. Without Iwo Jima, those aircraft would have ditched in the Pacific Ocean. Crew survival rates from ocean ditching were approximately 15%. With Iwo Jima available, survival rate was effectively 100%. Each B-29 carried an 11-man crew. 2,408 emergency landings potentially saved 26,488 aircrew lives. That number exceeded the total American casualties from capturing the island. The simple mathematics suggested that Iwo Jima's value as an emergency landing field alone repaid the cost of its capture, without even accounting for its value as a fighter base. But the fighter operations were what had changed the strategic equation. The ability to escort B-29 seconds over Japan hadn't just reduced bomber losses. It had eliminated Japanese fighter opposition as an effective defensive factor. By forcing the Japanese to either commit their remaining aircraft and lose them, or conserve them and allow unopposed bombing, fighter escorts had created a situation where continued resistance accomplished nothing except prolonging the inevitable. Japanese military leaders understood this by July 1945. The Supreme War Council meetings that month discussed the strategic situation in stark terms. Japan had lost air superiority over its own territory. Industrial production had collapsed to fractions of wartime peaks. Food supplies were critically short. The Soviet Union had denounced its neutrality pact and appeared ready to enter the war against Japan. The military situation was hopeless. Yet the Council remained divided on whether to accept the terms of the Potsdam Declaration, which demanded unconditional surrender. The military faction argued that Japan should fight to the end, inflicting maximum casualties on American forces during the expected invasion, hoping to make the cost so high that the United States would offer more favorable terms. The civilian faction argued that continued resistance was pointless, that Japan had already lost the ability to wage effective war, and that surrender now would prevent further destruction. The debate became moot on August 6th, when a B-29 named Enola Gay, escorted by 2 other superfortresses, dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, another B-29 named Boxcar dropped a second atomic bomb on Nagasaki. The atomic bombings killed approximately 215,000 people and introduced a weapon against which no defense existed. Emperor Hirohito intervened directly in the Supreme War Council's deliberations, announcing that Japan would accept the Potsdam Declaration's terms. On August 15, 1945, he broadcast a radio address informing the Japanese people that the war had ended. Japan's formal surrender came on September 2nd aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. The Pacific War's conclusion came not from a single cause, but from the accumulation of strategic defeats that had made continued resistance operationally impossible. The strategic bombing campaign had destroyed Japan's industrial capacity. The submarine blockade had eliminated access to imported resources. The island-hopping campaign had progressively captured bases from which American forces could strike the home islands directly. The atomic bombings demonstrated that Japan faced weapons against which conventional defenses were meaningless. But underlying all these factors was the systematic demolition of Japanese defensive calculations. Time after time, Japanese planners had concluded that certain American operations were impossible, only to watch those operations succeed. The distance to Tokyo was too great for American bombers, until B-29 seconds started burning Japanese cities from bases in the Marianas. The Marianas were too far from American carriers for invasion, until Operation Forager captured them with overwhelming force. Fighter escorts over Japan were impossible due to range limitations. Until P-51 seconds began flying from Iwo Jima. Each miscalculation compounded the previous ones, creating a cascade of strategic failures where defensive planning based on what the enemy couldn't do was repeatedly overtaken by what the enemy did. Japanese intelligence officers calculated range limitations, fuel consumption rates, and operational constraints accurately. Their error wasn't in the mathematics, but in assuming the Americans would accept those constraints, rather than changing the operational environment to overcome them. The P-51 escort missions from Iwo Jima represented the final iteration of this pattern. Japanese planners saw the distance from the Marianas to Tokyo and concluded fighter escorts were impossible. American planners saw the same distance and concluded they needed a base closer to Japan. The difference was that American industrial capacity, engineering skill, and military power allowed them to create that base where none had existed, turning a theoretical requirement into operational reality. By August 1945, Captain Robert Moore had completed 46 escort missions from Iwo Jima. He had shot down 3 Japanese fighters, damaged several others, and escorted hundreds of B-29 seconds to targets across Japan. His aircraft, a P-51D named Lucky Lady, showed battle damage from multiple engagements but continued flying. Moore survived the war, returned to the United States, and later described his service as routine, emphasizing that thousands of other pilots had done the same work. That sense of routine was itself significant. By mid-1945, fighter escort missions over Japan had become standard operations, no more remarkable than bomber missions over Germany had become by late 1944. The extraordinary had become ordinary through repetition and the systematic destruction of opposition. What Japanese commanders had declared impossible in February was routine by August, so thoroughly normalized that participants described it as unremarkable. The escorts continued until the war's final days. The last combat mission from Iwo Jima flew on August 15th, the day Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. Even then, the mission launched on schedule, escorting bombers whose crews didn't know the war was ending until they received recall orders over the target area. The bombers jettisoned their ordnance over the ocean and returned to base. The fighters escorted them home, maintaining formation discipline, even though no Japanese interceptors would challenge them. The Pacific War ended where it had begun, with American forces demonstrating capabilities that Japanese planners had miscalculated. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 had been predicated on the assumption that distance would protect Japan from American retaliation long enough to establish an impregnable defensive perimeter. That assumption proved wrong. American forces crossed the term Pacific, captured the islands Japan thought couldn't be taken, built the bases Japan thought couldn't be built, and flew the missions Japan thought couldn't be flown. The P-51 escorts over Tokyo were simply the final proof that Japan's defensive strategy had been built on faulty premises from the beginning. Distance didn't equal safety when the enemy had the industrial capacity to build 1,000-ship fleets and 100,000-man armies. Geographic barriers didn't provide protection when the enemy had the engineering capability to create bases anywhere they needed them. And enemy capabilities couldn't be predicted based on current technology when the enemy's research and production could develop new capabilities faster than intelligence could track them. Japanese military planners had looked at the vast Pacific Ocean and seen a defensive moat that would take years for Americans to cross. American military planners had looked at the same ocean and seen logistics problems that required systematic solutions. The difference in perspective was the difference between defensive thinking that emphasized barriers and offensive thinking that emphasized overcoming barriers. When those perspectives collided across 3.5 years of war, the outcome was determined by which side had the industrial and technological capacity to implement its vision. By September 1945, Japan's cities lay in ruins, its industrial base destroyed, its military forces shattered, and its defensive calculations proven comprehensively wrong. The B-29 seconds that had been called unreachable because they flew beyond fighter altitude had been escorted by fighters. Japanese intelligence insisted couldn't operate over Japan. The geographic barriers that were supposed to protect the home islands had been overcome by engineering that transformed volcanic rocks into operational airbases. The defensive strategy based on distance and altitude had collapsed when American forces simply changed the operational environment to nullify both advantages. The lesson wasn't subtle. Strategic planning based on what the enemy can't do will always be vulnerable to an enemy who can change what's possible. Japanese commanders in 1941 had calculated that American forces couldn't reach Japan effectively. They were right based on the capabilities that existed in 1941. They were catastrophically wrong about what capabilities would exist by 1945. The P-51 Mustangs that escorted B-29 seconds from Iwo Jima represented the culmination of that transformation. They flew missions that Japanese planners had declared impossible, based on mathematical certainties that proved to be based on incomplete understanding. And in flying those missions, they demonstrated that the only military certainty is that certainty itself is a dangerous assumption in war. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.